Hi everyone, this is Jim. Welcome to this last video in my little series of videos on the minority attack. In this video I'm going to take a look at ways that the defending side can defend against the minority attack. And the first game I have to show you as an example was played in 1962 at the USSR Championship in Yerevan. With the black pieces we have Alexei Suetin, and with the white pieces we have German Kodos. So this game starts off as a Grinfeld, actually. It's a good example of how you can get this kind of attack going from different openings. So after knight c3, instead of bishop g7, black plays with d5, the characteristic move of the Grinfeld. And now white, the kind of classical main line of the Grinfeld is to take, and then after the knight takes, play e4, and then after an exchange on c3, then white has this big pawn center, and then black sets out to undermine it in a classical Grinfeld strategy. White plays the second choice move here, which is knight f3, and this is a very respectable alternative, quite a popular second choice, and goes for the bishop g5 line here. So after bishop g7 goes bishop g5 and knight e4. So this is a position that's been seen many times. The bishop can retreat to either of those two squares. But the main move here is actually to take the pawn and allow black to get the bishop pair with this exchange. And black also gets the pawn back. It's not a pawn sack because e6 is played with a tempo on the knight, and the knight has to drop back, and black gets the pawn. And after a couple more moves, e3, castles, bishop e2, c6, we get the classical Karlsbad structure. So we see the pawns here against the pawns here. And white is ready to play a minority attack, and black still needs to complete his development. White needs to finish developing too. So the attack is usually not immediate at this point, but there's some moves played to prepare it. White castles, black goes bishop e6. The rook goes to c1. And now there's some maneuvering. And see, the queen goes to e7, and white has this idea with the knight, starting with knight a4. See, black develops this knight to d7 and drops the knight into c5. So white doesn't want to tolerate that knight being there, and doesn't want to push the b pawn forward and leave this backwards c pawn. So he exchanges, and white takes with the rook. So this kind of is the idea of white's plan. He's got the rook here so that this pawn will be held back, and then he can start pushing the queenside pawns and create a weakness here, which actually happens in the game. But at the same time, black has managed to complete his development. He's got the bishop pair, and this bishop is, which can sometimes be a bad bishop with all these light squared pawns, has got a pretty good diagonal to work with. And, well, it's black's move at this point in the game, and he starts off with f5. So this is black's strategy. White's strategy was to set up that minority attack. Black's strategy is to leave these pawns back. Don't waste any time on extra pawn moves, and just go directly for the kingside attack and try and take advantage of your bishop pair. So white gets the minority attack rolling here. It seems like white is a step ahead, but actually this position is really quite balanced. After this exchange, then there's time for white to get in the b4 push, and black needs to come back and defend. So we get this exchange, and so both sides are sort of getting what they want in this position. White has created this weakness over here, the classical minority attack weakness that he's going to be able to play against the rest of the game, but black has an active position with some pressure on the king side. So the position is about even, and stays that way for quite a while. So let's see, this rook drops back to c2, perhaps to defend along the second rank against any potential that black has on the king side. Let's see, this rook a to f8, coming over to double on the f file. Queen to d2, looking at coming out over to the queen side at some point. It doesn't happen right away. After queen d2, queen d6, there's a little bit of rook maneuvering. So rook e1, rook e8, rook d1. And now black decides to get something going on the king side with some more pawn pushes. h6. And now white decides this is a good time to come over and start taking a look at the queen side. So there is a threat immediately to the a-pawn. The rook drops back to defend. If the queen takes now, then bishop to f5, hitting the rook, is a sufficient answer. So the pawn is safe for now. The queen goes to a6, looking both at the c-pawn and the a-pawn. Black pushes on with g5. And so far, up to this point, this is still an even game. It's this next move is maybe perhaps the first slight inaccuracy. White plays the move h3. So the chess engine prefers to leave the pawns back and just play a move like bishop d3, which is actually the next move that white plays in the game. I mean, there are some weaknesses over here on black's king side. When he pushes those pawns forward, he leaves some holes behind, and so that seems to be an okay position. But h3 is a slight mistake. It gives black a little something to bite on in his king side attack. So after h3, black continues with queen to f4, getting over there immediately. Let's see, bishop to d3 now, pawn to g4. So opening up some lines here because it's hitting the pawn and the knight. And then that's why he played queen f4 first. He wanted to be able to take back with the queen. But now there's this little dance. So bishop e2 hitting the queen, queen f4, bishop d3, and queen g4. I guess both sides are testing the other to see who wants a draw. Black changes things up first by bringing the queen back to e6. So he opened up a line against the king, but could not find any immediate breakthrough, and just came back here to avoid the repetition and also to continue to hold on to the c-pawn here. White at this point decides to bring the queen back, queen to d3. The rook comes up to f4. But we can see that somehow, starting with that move h3, it seems like black has got a little bit more of an initiative than white. So let's see. White drops the queen back to d2. This queen goes to d6. Rook d to c1, doubling on the c file. Rook e to f8, getting back on the f file again. And then this next move is really the mistake that loses the game. The chess engine suggests that white is still okay with moves like either rook to b2 or perhaps rook to e1. Kind of funny to play rook e1 since the rook has been going back and forth between those squares. But it seems like the attack on the queen side is stalled. So this light squared bishop has come in really handy. It's still looking out on the king side, but it's also holding on to this backward c-pawn. So it's doing a nice double duty there. Anyway, the mistake that white makes is to play the move bishop to f1, and now you should be able to find the continuation from here. We're also on move 35, so it could be that white was in a lot of time pressure and had to make a move quickly. But yes, if you want some time here to find the winning continuation here, go ahead and pause the video. I'm going to give the answer away. So I hope you found this one. It is rook takes f3. Yeah, just sacrifice the exchange to open up some lines against the king. And it's pretty much all over. It's just winning according to the chess engine, and the moves are not that hard to find. The queen g3, or queen g6 rather. Queen g6 coming over to check the king. King goes to h1. The rook comes up to f5, so we've got this threat of the rook coming over to mate. Let's see, bishop to g2 to provide an escape route for the king. And now bishop to h3 attacking the pinned bishop. So this light squared bishop that was doing a defensive job over here on the queen side is also ready to jump into the attack over on the king side. Let's see, the king unpins. But after this check, white is just up material. King runs to e2, and then bishop to f3 check was played, giving the material back, but with a winning attack. King comes here, rook to h3 check, king back to e2, queen to g4 check, and there's a forced mate. So anyway, that's it for this game, and a nice finish. Let's take a look at the next one. The next game I wanted to show you was played in Moscow in 1967. We have, with the black pieces, Anatoly Lein, and with the white pieces we have Alexander Buslaev. So this was a ordinary Queen's Gambit decline. d4, d5, knight of 3, knight of 6, c4, and e6. So we're going to get the Karlsbad structure again, knight c3, bishop e7, after the exchange. So again, an exchange variation with bishop to g5 and black plays c6. So after queen c2, white didn't play e6 right away. So this is a slightly different line from white. And black plays the interesting move g6 here. So what black has is a different plan than what we saw. In the previous game we saw black holding on to this bishop and using it to defend the c6 pawn as well as to look out onto the king side. In this game, black is simply going to trade that bishop off. So after e3, plays bishop f5. So that was the point of that g6 move, was to support bishop f5. And this is a well-known plan. This position has been played many times before, and black gets in that trade and gets rid of his problem piece. Although, as we saw in the previous game, the problem piece can also be a hero as well. Anyway, knight bd7, we get both sides completing their development now with castles. And then rook a to b1. So white is signaling pretty clearly that he intends to play a minority attack. And black plays the move a5. So this is a second way in which this game is different. The plan here, for the moment, is just to hold off the minority attack by maintaining control over the b4 square. Now, white really could continue with a3 and b4 anyway. There's enough force there to kind of push that through, but he decides to play other moves for a while. So there's some maneuvering here. Queen c2. This knight goes to b6. This knight hops into e5. Good square for that knight. Rook to e8. This knight goes to a4, provoking an exchange. And so black trades off the knights and then plays queen to c8. This is not about defending the pawn at the moment. It's actually about looking at wrong way on the diagonal. Well, not that square, but looking at these squares along the diagonal, maybe coming out to f4 or f5 or e6. This queen just drops back to c2. Queen goes to e6. And now white decides to trade off one more pair of minor pieces and just go for a position where white has the knight against the bishop. And he has a good square for the knight. The knight is heading for that somewhat sensitive c5 square you see in this structure. So the knight goes back to d3. Let's see, the bishop goes to e7. So the bishop is maybe prepared to trade off the knight if it shows up on c5. But anyway, getting out of the way of the kingside pawns as well. The knight goes to c5 anyway, and now black decides not to trade the knight, but to defend the b pawn. If he pushes the b pawn, the knight moves, the c pawn is left in a weakened state. So he actually brings the queen back to c8 and defends his pawn. And this is the moment at which white decides to really get that minority attack going with a3. Let's see, so bishop to d6 was played, and now b4. A takes, and queen to c7. So black is lining up, taking a look at the king side this way. So g3 is played to prevent the loss of the pawn over there, and black goes with h5. So we see something similar to the last game. A different selection of pieces, but the kind of overall concept is at some point black gives up on trying to hold back this this pawn and just goes for counterplay on the king side. So b5 is happening, and h4. So taking on c6, and white has achieved that weakened c-pawn. It's his goal in the minority attack. And And then right here, after b takes c6, he drops the knight back to b3. Maybe he was already starting to worry a little bit about what's happening over here on the king side. You know, it is potentially developing pretty quickly. There's pawn takes pawn to open up the h-file. There's king to g7 and the rook coming over. So it's a pretty fast attack. I have to say the chess engine is not yet worried and would play a move like just rook to e1. I don't know what that move is doing. I think if I were not moving the knight but doing something with the rooks, I would probably try and lift this rook and bring this rook over and try and get more pressure on the c-pawn as white here. But anyway, that was the chess recommendation, and the move that was actually played was knight to d3. Seems like white is paying some respect to black's attacking chances. So, but king g7 anyway, the attack is going to happen one way or another. And now rook f to c1. This is the idea I was talking about, bringing the rooks over here to get more pressure on the c-pawn. Rook a to c8, defending. King to g2, maybe allowing these rooks to come over in case the h-file is opened up, so a useful defensive move. Queen goes to d7, and now rook to b6, piling up on the c-pawn, and it's no longer defensible. So the game is reaching kind of a critical stage. Black plays the move queen to g4. So he couldn't defend the pawn directly, but actually that pawn cannot be taken just yet. In fact, white in the game plays the move f3. But, well, for example, if white were to take here, rook takes c6, black would ignore things and just take on g3. And if white keeps taking, there is actually a forced mate here. So, because this comes with check. And, you know, where can the king go? If the king goes here, that is mate. Notice that the bishop is defending that pawn. The king has no squares. And let's see, where else could he go? If the king goes back here, then queening the pawn is also mate, because this queen is blocking the escape square. So that is an attack that you have to respect here. Let's see, instead of taking the rook here and allowing the mate, you could continue to fight like this, but this is still a winning attack for black here. After h takes g3, black can exchange, which drags the queen away from defense of the knight. And then there's this nice maneuver. There's queen e4 check. And if the king goes to g1, or if it goes to the h-file, this rook is coming over with a mate threat. So actually the king has to go to f1. And after the king goes to f1, then the queen takes the knight with check. And now black is a piece up because he has time to save the bishop. So that is also winning. So in this position, it's really not safe to take that pawn. And white correctly calculated that, played f3. And now the queen has to come back, queen to e6. And once again, this pawn is hanging, but it's not yet safe to take it. In this case, if rook takes, queen takes, there's h3 check. The point of h3 check is to drag the king away from defense of these pawns, or to push them back. And wherever the king goes, the queen is crashing through here with a devastating attack here. So, and not safe to grab that pawn just yet. So anyway, interesting play from black here. He's sort of forced into it because he really has no good way to defend that c-pawn. So his only hope is this pressure on the king side. So so white here, instead of grabbing the pawn immediately, plays knight to e5. And so this gives up a pawn, but it does take out one of those key attacking pieces, and buys enough time for white to go ahead and grab that pawn on c6. But in the meantime, black has grabbed the pawn that was on d4. So so the material is still even. So here's this exchange. Queen takes, pawn to h3 check, and the king took. I think it's not much better if the king goes the other way. The king took, and then queen went here with check. King went back, and the rook came up and grabbed this pawn. And so black sacrificed a pawn over here and grabbed a pawn over here. So once again, the material balance has been restored, but black has a pretty good position. I don't want to show the rest of the game, but he went on to win. Some of the trump cards he has here are this passed pawn and the active pieces around the king. So this passed pawn can be very dangerous, particularly when there's a queen on the board to support it and a rook to keep the king screened off from getting over to stop that. So black has really excellent chances here. Although, to be honest, if you put this in a chess engine, it says that white should be able to defend. I think I would really prefer to be black in this position. Okay, but that's it for this game, and let's take a look at the next one. This game was played in the 1952 Interzonal in Saltsjöbaden, Sweden. With the black pieces we have Gideon Stallberg, a many-time Swedish and Nordic champion, and with the white pieces we have Paul Vaitanas. So this starts off with c4. White starts off with c4, but it turns into a queen's gambit declined after a few moves. So d4, knight f6, knight f3, d5, knight to c3, knight bd7, and white goes for the exchange variation again. C takes, e takes, and bishop g5. So black just plays c6 immediately. White goes with e3, and we get this standard position. So bishop e7, queen to c2, and knight to f8. So knight f8 is an interesting maneuver. This knight is not headed here to g6, but rather is headed here to e6 to harass that bishop. And actually, it's an interesting central location for the knight. Let's see. White keeps developing. Bishop d3. The knight goes to e6. This bishop drops back. And then black plays the move g6. I think maybe he's worried about this battery lined up on the h-pawn. It doesn't seem like black is going to be able to get in the move bishop to f5, because with this battery already set up by white, that would just lose a pawn, even if the knight weren't blocking it. So anyway, both sides continue developing. Castles, castles. Rook a to b1, preparing the minority attack. And black decides to trade off the dark squared bishop, so he goes knight h5. So even if the bishop retreats, he'll be able to grab it. So white trades and plays rook f to e1. Black just brings his knight back. It's sort of done its job. And white gets the minority attack rolling with b4. Black plays bishop d7, and white goes b5. And the next move is the one I wanted to show you. At this point, black just played c5. So white didn't do anything to stop c5. Of course, a lot of times black doesn't want to play c5 because he's left with an isolated queen's pawn. But that's not always a bad thing. If white takes here, black takes. This is certainly playable for white, but seems like a decent position for black. He can get a rook to the c file, get some pressure here pretty quickly, and these pawns on the queen side are not going to be able to open up any more lines. And there's always dynamic possibilities with this isolated queen's pawn of maybe pushing it forward at the right time. I would say the only thing that is a little bit awkward about black's position is this bishop is a little bit hemmed in by this pawn. But other than that, it seems like it's quite a playable position. In any case, white decided not to take black up on the offer. So after black played c5, white went queen to b2, just getting the queen out of the way and preparing to bring a rook over to the c file. So black brought his rook over to the c file. Now rook b to c1 was played, and queen to d6. And now white went queen to a3. And this is really the last chance that that white has to take this pawn. And once again, this is a position that is playable for both sides. And it's interesting. You can see that black is prepared by lining up the queen behind the pawn and is looking forward to maybe pushing that forward. I guess he needs maybe to bring this knight back to e6, but then he can kind of push that forward and bust things up. So it seems like I said, a decent isolated queen's pawn position for black. So he's not afraid of that. But after queen a3, he decides to just close things off with the move b6. And so the queen side is pretty solid. This is an example where the minority attack didn't really result in any weaknesses over here. White tries to counter in the center with the move e4, an interesting kind of dynamic way to play. But this leads to some exchanges. So black takes the pawn, knight takes, bishop takes, hitting the rook in the corner. The rook goes to b8, and then the queen grabs the a pawn. But at the same time, when the queen grabs the a pawn, the b pawn is left hanging. Actually, the chess engine slightly prefers playing rook to b1, trying to keep the pressure up. It's going to be a little bit tricky for black to defend that, but black also has the option of taking the d pawn here too. So I think the material balance will stay, and it's still in the range of about even. Anyway, the way the game went, queen takes a7, bishop takes b5, and then white kept on exchanging with d takes c5, knight takes c5, and that's all the further I'm going to go in this game. This is really just an even position that black did go on to win this game, but if we look at the overall character of the position, we see that both sides have an isolated pawn over here on the queen side. Both sides have active pieces, and both kings are fairly secure. So really is quite an even position, and so you can call that a success from the point of view of neutralizing white's initiative and getting to a playable position with black. You can say that black has equalized here and has a pretty comfortable game. And as it turns out, black went on to win. Okay, so I just had one more game I wanted to show you. Let's take a look at this. The last game I wanted to show you was played at the Russian Team Championship of 2011 in Olgenka, Russia. The players here, with the white pieces, we had Alexander Shimonov, and with the black pieces, we had the Chinese Grandmaster Wang Hao. So this started off as a Nimzo Indian. So white started off with d4, black goes knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, and bishop b4, the characteristic Nimzo Indian move, and white plays e3, the Rubinstein variation. So black castles, white goes knight to e2, just defending this knight, preparing to take back with a knight instead of a pawn, so as to avoid the pawn damage over on the queen side. Black goes with d5 here, and white plays a3, kicking the bishop. And Wang Hao decides to keep the bishop. Now there's no real point to taking this knight off. And in a way, the bishop has done its job. While it was holding on to this pin, this white's control over the e4 square was weakened, and white played the move e3 rather than e4. So you can say, in a way, its job is done, and it just drops back. Why not keep that bishop? So white takes on d5, black takes back, and white plays b4, and black plays c6. And we see that once again we've gotten the minority attack going. We see this familiar Karlsbad structure. I wanted to pause here and just talk a little bit about different responses that black has tried that we've looked at in this video. The first idea was to just keep all of these pawns, the queenside pawns, where they were, not move them at all, and just go directly for a kingside attack. The second idea was to get in the move a5, before white had a chance to play b4, and hold off the minority attack for a while organizing some play against the center or the king side. Another idea along the same vein is to play a6. That is played a lot with the similar kind of idea of just holding off these pawns for a while so that black has time to get organized and get something going either in the center or on the king side. And then, oh, we saw the idea in the third game where black waited for white to push on with b5 and then played the move c5, allowing the creation of an isolated queen's pawn here. So those are the ideas we've looked at so far. Wang Hao has a different idea first. But both sides, before they do anything more on the queen side, they decide at this point to complete their development. So knight to e3, g3, getting out of the way of the bishop so that white can eventually castle. Bishop to e6. Actually, this is a very standard position up to this point, and the most common move here is rook e8. But there's nothing wrong with this bishop e6 move. It's just that we're getting into less trodden territory at this point. White continues with bishop d3. These are all still very normal moves. Knight bd7, white castles. And now here's the move. Here's the move that is different from the previous games. Wang Hao plays b5. And this move really shuts down the minority attack. These pawns are really not coming forward anymore, or if they do, the most they can do is trade themselves off. And so the queen side becomes kind of frozen at this point, and both sides are going to have to look for play on the king side or in the middle. Well, that's not entirely true, but let's watch how the game unfolds. Let's see, it's white's turn here. White starts migrating this knight over to the king side. It's heading for the f4 square. And black has an idea for this knight and starts migrating it over to the queen side. I should mention the downside of this formation is that it does leave this c-pawn a bit backwards, and so you do have to take care when playing this way, and it's just interesting to watch how Wang Hao handled that situation. So this knight hopped into f4, hitting the bishop on e6, which Wang Hao ignored and just played bishop to d6, getting this bishop on a better square, and saying go ahead and take this bishop if you want it, which white can do. White can grab that bishop and get the bishop pair. But this is a decent formation for black with all these pawns on light squares and this dark squared bishop shooting through on the open diagonals. It seems like black has a decent position here. So white was not tempted by this move. After bishop d6, he starts rearranging his own pieces over here. He plays bishop to c2. And now this knight hops into c4. So that was the point of this knight maneuver, was to shield the c-pawn. At least that's one point. And this seems like a pretty neat arrangement. It's now really very difficult for white to get any pressure against this pawn, but you still have to answer the question about this knight. Is this knight really a help or a hindrance? Because it is going to be somewhat frozen in this position, if it's doing just this one job of shielding the c-pawn, it hardly seems worthwhile. But the thing to keep in mind is that it's also looking at potentially sensitive spots inside white's camp. So it's not an offsides piece. If the action totally shifts to the king side, it's one hop away, and it is looking at some squares in the center, and also back here if stuff starts to happen on e5. Okay, and that white comes up with an interesting plan here. I think the chess engine would like to start chipping away at this pawn structure right away with a move like a5. So that's the way there can still be some action on the queen side. But white has a different idea. White plays rook b1, and black goes for a5. And now white raises the rook up to b3. So this is his plan. He's going to hold on to these pawns on the queen side with the rook, and the rook is also in a position, perhaps, for example, if this e-pawn were to go forward, could perhaps swing across to the king side. So that's potentially an aggressive rook there on the third rank. But, well, we'll see how Wang Hao handles this. First, he takes on b4, opening up the a file for his rook. And now he drops his rook all the way down to a1. A bit of an annoying piece down there. Something that white always has to worry about a little bit. Although after queen d3, it doesn't seem like that rook is doing so much. I mean, this bishop is well defended, and it's not pinned either. It can always move because this rook is well defended. But it is maybe a little bit of an irritant there to have this rook sitting on your own back rank. After queen d3, black goes queen to e7, and white goes f3. So white has the idea of just accepting that the queen side is somewhat frozen and going for counterplay in the center. So f3 to be followed by e4, and just kind of open up the position, and maybe on a good day get something going on that diagonal. Although at the moment this knight is pretty securely defending the h7 square. Black plays g6 anyway. G6 is kind of a multi-purpose move. It keeps the knight from hopping out of into these squares, and it shuts down any potential along this diagonal. So black is feeling pretty safe, even though I guess in theory there have been some dark squared weaknesses created here that maybe in the long run black could think about exploiting. Let's see. Knight f to e2. I mean, white could think about exploiting. Yeah. So white drops the knight back to e2. And actually, he is immediately thinking about opening up this diagonal, so getting the knight out of the way and pushing the pawn forward. And we see that happening in the game. And to do that, he's willing to give up this pawn. So he left this pawn undefended over here on b4, and black just takes it. And white pushes on with e4. So white has kind of gotten what he wanted. Some activity in the center, an open diagonal for the bishop, and maybe it can hop into the h6 square at an annoying moment. But Wang Hao manages to find a way to keep things going in his favor. So he just takes. White takes back and plays the move knight to g4. So that's a pretty active post for the knight, and the two pieces are, the two knights are actually coordinating now and looking at the e3 square. And there may be something happening on f2 as well. And there's also this potential of a discovered attack on the rook. So a move like knight to e3 here would unleash the bishop on this rook, and the knight would hit this rook. So white just drops the rook back to b1. It kind of a dual-purpose move, get that rook out of trouble, and trade off this annoying rook on the back rank. So Wang Hao exchanges here, and then plays the move knight c to e3, which at first looks like it shouldn't be possible, but he plays it anyway. And the response from white is that white resigned. so here's a puzzle for you. If you want to think about this, it's a worthwhile puzzle. I think maybe you'll be able to figure it out. Why is it that white resigned? So if you want some time to think about it, go ahead and pause the video right now. I'm going to give the answer away now. I'll give it in pieces. So first, rather than talking about taking the knight first, which is maybe the most obvious move, let's say you can't take that knight for some reason and you try to find other moves. Well, you notice that the knight is hitting the rook. So you might try the move rook to f3. Just try to live with that knight there for a move. Maybe put some more pressure on the e3 square and see if you can survive this position. And the answer is you can't, because of bishop c4. So this is one of the key problems for white in this position. The queen has no moves. The two bishops are covering this whole row of squares that the queen might go to. This diagonal square is covered by the knight, and that square is covered by the bishop, and that square is covered by the knight. So if we look at all of those squares, one of black's pieces is covering each and every one of them, and the queen is lost. So let's go back to the original position. So knight c to e3. So the kind of the most immediate response is just to take that knight off. And can you see the idea here? What does black play that refutes this move? Okay, pause the video if you want time to think about it. I'm going to give the answer away now. Then the previous variation obviously was a clue, because the answer is once again bishop to c4. The queen has a few moves this time, but look at where those moves are. First of all, notice that all these squares are taken by the bishops. So the only squares that are available for the queen are these two squares. which are light-colored squares that are one knight's hop away from that bishop position. So wherever the queen goes, black plays knight takes bishop, getting his piece back and winning the exchange at least. So so anyway, that is why white resigned. I mean, at best, white is going to be down a pawn and the exchange, and you know, black's pieces are just tremendously posted. It might already have a killing attack. So so anyway, it was not an early resignation. It was a justified resignation. So let's go back to the end of the game. This was the final position here, knight c to e3, just dropping that knight into a square where it looks like it's not even safe, and your opponent resigns. Kind of a nice finish. Okay, that's it for this video and for this little series of videos on the minority attack. The next topic is Top 10 Middle Game Ideas number 5, where I will look at attacks on opposite wings. See you then. Bye.